think it's working.
Go real close to it. That's better. I think you're going to like this. Welcome to Cults and the Media. We will take an inside, first-hand look at the newest battleground targeted by cults for their infiltration. That target is the media, newspapers, magazines, television, radio, video, movies. We will take a definitive focus on the efforts of the Unification Church and their efforts to infiltrate the national and worldwide media. But for a moment, what are the other cults doing? Some interesting things. Many of them have their own newspapers, certainly. Here is something from the International Society on Christian Consciousness. It's their newspaper. There's an article in this criticizing the Pope for accepting Darwin's theory of evolution. Kind of interesting. Also from that organization is their in-house organ, Atma, which contains such articles as the ultimate anti-material particle. Okay, I can't bend down anymore. The ultimate anti-material particle and vegetarianism and beyond. The Executive Intelligence Review, which is the LaRouche magazine. The LaRouche newspaper, the New Federalist, which has an article, the headline of which is Helga LaRouche Briefs Poland. Imagine that, they must have had a big room for that. And here is something I understand that the Scientologists printed 5 million copies of these, entitled Scientology, What Is It? It's a good question. With us this morning are three very, very distinguished and knowledgeable guests. William Cheshire, who resigned as editorial page editor from the Washington Times in 1987, along with 4 of his staff, when the Unification Church attempted to influence editorial policy. Michael Warder, who spent 10 years as a very high-ranking official in the Unification Church. Part of it as president and publisher of News World, the church's daily newspaper, and president of the church's own wire service, the Free Press International. James R. Whelan, the founding editor and former publisher and chief executive officer of the Washington Times. Mr. Whelan left the Times in 1984 over the church's intrusion into the newspaper's operations. Please welcome our guests this morning. I am sure that many of you will have questions for our guests, and for efficiency, we're going to proceed by established rules of the National Press Club for questions. On your seat, you'll find an index card. If you have a question for one of our guests, please clearly state and clearly write, since I'm going to have to read it, clearly write your question and to whom that question is directed. If you are a journalist, and there are some journalists with us this morning, please jot down the name of your news organization. That'll help as well. Pass your questions to the side. If the people on the side aisles would be kind enough to accept those questions and kind of hold your hand out when you have a few of them, pass your questions to the side, and the monitors will come down, please, periodically, collect those questions, and bring them to me. Also, according to National Press Club rules, we've decided whether this is on the record or off the record. And by the unanimous agreement, enthusiastic agreement of our guests, this is all on the record. Before I introduce our first speaker this morning, let me take just a few minutes to frame this discussion with a profile of this gigantic animal we call the national media. An understanding of the media's sheer scope and power and influence in society today reveals why the cults are working so hard to purchase and manage and control media organizations worldwide. The overall numbers on the national and worldwide media are staggering. 11,000 radio stations in the United States, 1,500 television stations, 11,000 magazines, 7,600 weekly newspapers, 1,600 daily newspapers. Arthur Sulzberger said that a reader's judgment cannot be better than the information on which he bases it. And with that in mind, consider how and to whom that information is communicated. 94 million Americans have at least one television set in their homes. That's just about everybody. We watch an average of 4 hours of television a day. Older Americans watch 8 hours of television a day. There are more radios in the United States than there are people, 350 million. More than 124 million people, Americans, read a daily newspaper every day. If indeed the media is where the mass of Americans get their information, and from which they form their opinions and their insights, then we can understand both the desire of the cults to control a good portion of that information and understand the need, the compelling need, for the free and working press of the nation to fully examine and expose this issue. A free press, theoretically at least, works like scientists or scholars to get at and reveal the truth. A sullied, a compromised press, however, becomes a hired agent set up for no other reason than to manipulate that truth. Thomas Carlyle in his day called the press a weapon in the wrong hands. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda, called Nazi Germany's control of the media our most potent means of conquest, a device more to be feared than 1 million charging bayonets and 1,000 rolling tanks. Our first guest this morning is William P. Cheshire, the past editor of the editorial pages of the Unification Church-owned Washington Times, and currently the editor of the editorial pages of the Arizona Republic. Mr. Cheshire has held management positions with such papers as the Charleston Daily Mail, the Greensboro, North Carolina Record, and the Richmond News Leader. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Policy Review, and various professional journals. Please welcome Mr. Cheshire.
Thank you very much, Joe. Can I be heard? I'm reminded of a story, probably apocryphal, that someone told on Lyndon Johnson, that supreme egotist. And his first meeting with Prime Minister, I believe, Harold Wilson of England. Mr. Wilson was visiting the White House, and he and LBJ were sitting in front of the fireplace in the president's office, and Mr. Wilson was going on about how pleased he was to finally be able to sit down with the leader of the American people. And he said, Mr. Johnson, forgive me if I am mistaken, but I am informed that you were born in a log cabin. Am I correct? And LBJ grinned and he said, no, Mr. Prime Minister, you have me confused with Abraham Lincoln. I was born in a manger. Well, as compared with the megalomania of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, Lyndon Johnson was a shrinking violet. In August of this year, Moon proclaimed himself the Messiah. This had long been hinted at, but never directly confirmed from Father's mouth until he met with a group of his followers in San Francisco last August. I point this out because for some reason beyond my comprehension, the wire service is neglected to transmit this riveting announcement to the East Coast, and a great many people in the Midwest and eastern United States did not know that Father had come out of the closet, so to speak. Well, if the Reverend Moon is indeed the Messiah, he is certainly a strange one. Jesus Christ preached humility and sacrifice. Moon lives in a mansion in upstate New York and gets about in a stretch Mercedes limousine. Jesus healed the sick and preached peace on earth. Moon manufactures weapons for the South Korean government and sells magic icons to superstitious Japanese. Jesus fed the 5,000. Moon married them in Madison Square Garden. I'd like to talk a bit about the weapons manufacturing business. and Moon's business operations, because I think they're essential to understanding possibly part of Moon's motivation, or I think he has several. And also they may assist in understanding where the money comes from, assuming that he does not divide it as Jesus divided the bread and the fishes. Moon's first business enterprise was the York Shotgun and Air Rifle Company, a manufacturer of hunting rifles. This being the modern-day equivalent, I suppose, of a carpenter's shop. Moon ordered his followers to sell the rifles, established sales quotas for members of the Unification Church, and the business flourished. Then in the mid-1960s, he got his first government contract to produce wooden rifles for training in military students in high schools and universities in Korea. In 1968, he changed his company's name to Tong II Company, which means, Tong II means unification in Korean. 4 years later, he got a government contract to manufacture transmissions and axles, probably for military vehicles in part. The same year, he got a government license to manufacture firearms. Today, Tong II is the recognized leader in Korea in the manufacture of small and medium caliber gun barrels. It also makes heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, Vulcan anti-aircraft guns, all under contract to the South Korean government. Is this big business? You bet it is. 3 years ago, Tong II sold nearly $200 million worth of weapons, machinery, and auto parts. And Tong II is only one part of a conglomerate of more than 20 firms. The 7 largest of these firms in 1987 had sales of $460 million. Arnaud de Bourgrave, who is now the editor-in-chief of the Washington Times, was taken on a tour of Korea by Bo-hee Pak, Reverend Moon's principal lieutenant and the de facto publisher of the Washington Times. He's taken on a tour of Korea and visited the factory outside Busan, where these firearms and automobile axles and truck axles and so forth are manufactured. He described it when he came back to the editors of the Times as absolutely the largest manufacturing plant he'd ever seen in his life. He said the floor was so big that one could almost see the curve of the horizon at the other end of the factory. And the managers of the Tong II manufacturing plant told de Bourgrave, "We are the logistical tail of the Washington Times," which is to say that they provided the money, some $35 to $40 million a year, that it takes to operate the Times and absorb its deficit. Well, this plainly is not so. It cannot be so for this reason. Despite its government contracts, its links with Rockwell International, for example, its government protection, in 1988, the Seoul government prohibited the DuPont company from competing with Moon's Hankook Titanium Company, giving him a protected market in that field. Despite all this, Moon's business empire earned less than $10 million in 1986, and in previous years it had suffered net losses. And during this time of economic dearth, the Reverend Moon was founding the Washington Times, which, as I say, is subsidized in the amount of $30 to $40 million a year, not counting startup costs at the Times, which Jim Whelan may have a good idea of, and better than mine, but I understand that renovation of the office building alone cost them about $50 million. So during the same period, he established Insight Magazine, which absorbs another $40 million a year. The World and I, whose annual subsidy is unknown but is estimated at about $10 million a year, in addition to all his other enterprises in this country and abroad. Those who have tracked the expenditures of Moon's organization estimate them at about $450 million a year. Where does the money come from? Well, let me speculate. 3 weeks ago, I entertained at the Arizona Republic, where I work, the ambassador of South Korea and several of his aides. He was on a swing through the Southwest, and he came by the editorial board of the Republic, and thinking that I might extract from him unawares some information that he might not tell me if he knew my background, I went up early and introduced myself to the ambassador, and in the way of making idle chit-chat, I asked how long he had been in Washington. "I've been in Washington about 2 years," he said. I said, "I used to work at the Washington Times. Perhaps you know my former colleagues there, Ambassador Hassan and Colonel Bohe Pak." Well, he had an aide with him, a young man he had brought from the embassy in Washington, who leaned over when I asked my question and sort of sotto voce said, "Chosim." Well, the ambassador became very cautious, and he said, "Oh, Ambassador Hahn. Yes, he was ambassador to Norway, I believe. No, I have not seen him since I have been in Washington." So how about Colonel Pak? Do you know him? "Oh, I know of Colonel Pak, but no, I have not had a chance to see him either." Unknown to the ambassador, one of my editorial writers who attended this meeting with the ambassador is a former Peace Corps volunteer in Korea and speaks Korean somewhat fluently. So after the meeting, I asked him, I said, "Joel, what is this chosim business? What does that mean?" He said, "It means careful, go easy." Now, why would the ambassador of South Korea need to go easy when asked a perfectly straightforward question whether he knew two of his countrymen who are the effective publishers of one of the two daily newspapers in the capital city of the United States to which he is an ambassador? In the summer of 1970, this may give you an indication, as it does me, in summer of 1970, South Korean President Park Chung-hee, who ran the Republic of Korea from 1969 to 1971 when his chief of internal security assassinated him, held a top-level meeting in the Blue House, which is the Korean equivalent of the White House, the presidential residence. And there he and the top leaders of his government laid out a very ambitious plan for influence peddling inside the government of the United States. The plan involved 3 thrusts into Washington, one headed by Bohe Pak, one headed by Tong II Park, whose name may ring a bell if you're familiar with the Koreagate scandal of the late 70s, mid-70s, and the third headed by General Kang Young-hoon. Now, the idea as laid out at that meeting was that these 3 men would operate different phases of a divided operation. Suspicious by nature and fearing rivals, rightly so as it turned out, President Park divided the authority into these 3 parts, like Gaul, and all 3 of his lieutenants reported directly to him. According to Robert Betcher, staff director of the House Subcommittee on International Relations, which investigated the Koreagate scandal under Congressman Donald Fraser, the operation broke down like this. Tong II Park, operating out of his Georgetown Club, a lavish facility in Georgetown, acted as Seoul's chief lobbyist and directed the Korean Central Intelligence Agency in the embassy. Bohe Pak ran the far-flung Moon operations, and General Kang ran the Research Institute on Korean Affairs, a Republic of Korea front group in the Washington area. Tong II Park, greedy and ambitious, overplayed his hand. precipitating the Koreagate investigation of 1976 and 1977 and 78. But the investigation, and particularly the press investigation, as well as the congressional investigation, concentrated on Tong II Park to the exclusion of the other two players. And in fact, relatively speaking, Tong II Park was a minor player. In his book, this is what Mr. Betcher has to say about the investigation. The regrettable thing is, he says, that the Koreagate press failed to probe Moon's activities. There were news stories reporting congressional findings that Moon had ties with the KCIA, but Moon was a distant second to the press's fixation on the bribing of congressmen. As a result, most Americans never knew that the Korean influence campaign had an element much more destructive to society than Tong II Park. Moon's cult, lying to people in the streets, was making more money in 3 months than Tong II Park made in 6 years. Mr. Betcher goes on to say that the top government officials in Washington, including Henry Kissinger, knew that espionage was taking place and that members of Congress were being bribed. At least 2 members of Congress were on the Korean payroll. Yet none of these officials did anything about it, even as they do nothing today. Despite flagrant violations of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, official Washington still keeps hands off the new Koreagate scandal, the operations of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. I'd like to read you a little bit about the Foreign Agent Registration Act, very briefly, so that you may grasp to what degree Moon appears to be in violation of it. Listen to what the Act says. It says, an agent of a foreign principal must file a true and complete registration statement with the Attorney General of the United States and register with the Secretary of State. It defines agent of a foreign principal as any person who acts as an agent of a foreign government, partnership, corporation, organization, or other combination of persons. And it includes any newspaper, magazine, periodical, or other publication, unless it has at least 80% owned by, and its officers and directed, if any, are citizens of the United States, and it is not owned, directed, supervised, controlled, subsidized, or financed, and none of its policies are determined by any foreign principal. The Washington Times, Insight Magazine, The World, and I all satisfy the requirements of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. None of them is registered with the Secretary of State's office. None of them files annual reports with the Attorney General's office, because I have checked. There is no Moon operation that I am aware of that is registered under that act. Moon operates one of 2 daily newspapers in our nation's capital, a paper that the President says he reads first thing every morning. His cabinet reads it, influential members of Congress reads it. He operates a weekly news magazine reaching opinion leaders from coast to coast. He is backing the American Freedom Coalition, a strange mixture of Moonies and fundamentalist Christians who hope to organize at the grassroots and skew the American political system to the far right. He is buying into political action committees, runs dozens of front groups from CAUSA International to Professors World Peace Academy, and his Atlantic Video is among the biggest television production companies in America, according to my friend Mr. Whelan, who is knowledgeable about these as he is about so many matters. It is the largest television production facility east of California. Even so, throughout official Washington, not just in the Korean embassy, the word is chosim. Go slow on Reverend Moon. So the klaxon horns do not sound. No one appears to care very much that the American political institutions have been subverted by foreign interests. What must it take, I cannot help wondering, to arouse the curiosity of Congress and the Attorney General of the United States?
Mr. Cheshire referred to the fact that the President says he reads the Washington Times every day. If we want to wonder why we should be concerned about the Washington Times, we need only look as far as their own information. This is a advertising solicitation that I received encouraging me to purchase advertising for special interest groups that I represent. It says, Washington, D.C., where the decision makers of business and government form policies that have local, national, and international impact. The Washington Times provides a vital link to key decision makers at the White House, on Capitol Hill, and throughout other government agencies. It goes on to say, the national award-winning Washington Times saturates Capitol Hill every weekday with 1,200 hand-delivered newspapers. This means that every member of Congress, every senator, every committee and subcommittee member, every Supreme Court justice, including the Sergeant at Arms to the Secretary of State, receives a copy of the Washington Times. We know they read the Times because they tell us. President George Bush stated that, quote, the Washington Times is the first paper I read every morning. Our next guest is Michael Y. Warder. Mr. Warder is the highest-ranking American official of the Unification Church to discuss publicly its inner workings. After 10 years, Mr. Warder left the church in 1979. Mr. Warder is now Executive Vice President with the Rockford Institute, a research and publications organization concerned with the traditions and principles of American culture. Among his many responsibilities, Mr. Warder handles media relations and does writing and speaking on U.S.-Soviet relations. Mr. Warder's writings have appeared in such publications as USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Indianapolis Star, and many, many others. Michael Warder.
Thank you for the welcome and the invitation to be here. For some of you in the audience, you may remember me in a previous incarnation. I should tell a little bit about why I'm here. When my wife and I left the Unification Church in November of 1979 with our 2 children, we wondered, of course, what we should be doing next. We discussed our future. We concluded that having anything to do with the Reverend Moon, particularly with anti-Reverend Moon, would be non-productive for our family's mental and emotional well-being. Also, we couldn't see how that would help put bread on the table. I had to earn a living. So we basically decided that we would have as little to do with anti-Moonism or whatever as possible. And as some of you know, shortly after I did get a job in Washington, there were reports that I was a mole for Moon in Washington, printed reports in several different publications. And so then I was faced with the dilemma of, explaining myself more completely. In the meantime, I got a subpoena from the Justice Department on some investigation into tax matters. That was a further impetus to keep my mouth shut at that time. And in any case, for better or for worse, we decided that we would put that phase of our life behind us. And nonetheless, after a period of about 8 years, you can't really put 10.5 years of your life, pretend it doesn't exist. But what got my attention at that time was when Richard Viguerie took $10 million from the Reverend Moon to help his failing direct mail business. That figure was a nice round number. It was a big number. It wasn't as big as the startup costs for the Washington Times, but nonetheless it was to one individual to help bail out his failed business. And that got my attention. And I began to think about that, and I thought, well, I'd been out of the organization for 8 years. If I were to talk about these matters, I think that the people who knew me professionally after that experience would not get me canned, or which is a possibility always, or it would inhibit any future income potential from, people don't like you too much if you've been associated with a cult. They question your mental stability and that sort of thing, politely. In any case, I thought $10 million, and I had enough confidence in the people with whom I was working, and the board members, and et cetera. And I thought, well, I'll write an article. And I wrote the article, which some of you may have seen on front groups and how they work and Moon's conception of things. Well, the organization that published it, which is my employer, got a whole bunch of nasty letters. And of course I understood that that would happen, and I, in fact, had told them that. But normally our circulation isn't that big, and we don't get a whole bunch of nasty, vicious, really vicious letters. And of course that affected things. And one of the guys was on vacation, the editor, and I said to another guy, I said, well, do you want positive letters saying that what I wrote about was the truth? And he didn't know what to make of that, but I concluded nonetheless it would be good to have a few positive letters. And so I don't know how it was, but Cynthia, I think I called Cynthia, and I said, Cynthia, here's the situation. I explained it to her, and pretty soon I had a positive letter from Cynthia. And I then had, and I should thank Marcia Rudin and her husband. I called up Rabbi Rudin. I hadn't seen him at all for a long, long time, and I don't think I'd ever seen him, in fact, but I knew of him. And I talked to him on the phone, and I said, here's the situation, and he wanted to see the article, and he said, of course, and so he wrote a very nice letter in saying, yeah, what Warder said is true. And so there were other letters, so I want to thank you for that. And that's a little bit about why I'm here. Speaking to you, I was trying to think, now, how did this come about exactly? And I think I owed you one for that. Of course, when I left, I had to admit to myself that, and my wife too, that we'd made a serious error of judgment. I joined when I was 22. I left when I was 33. And I suppose this talk in some way is to explain myself. I'd like to reiterate what the previous speaker said in terms of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I conclude that the reason why there is no action is that so many of the congressmen and people in the executive branch, like the Washington Times, because of the publicity it brings them, many of them, I'm sure, have received honoraria and travel tickets to go to various conferences. They surely have their pictures featured with all these various characters, and that any investigation would be very embarrassing to them. And I think it cuts across Republican and Democratic lines. I don't think it's... There are certainly conservative inroads, but not exclusively. Joseph Lowry surely is not a right-wing conservative, nor is Lawrence Tribe, nor is the late Ralph Abernathy. So I think it's a bipartisan or nonpartisan problem. In any case, I also should mention something about the air rifles. I hadn't thought about the air rifles for a long time. When I joined in '69, there were still people in the Bay Area of San Francisco trying to sell these darn things. It's extremely difficult to start a, well, however you would call it, a church or a religion or a movement or something like that, where you would say on the other hand world peace, and then you'd be selling air rifles. And nonetheless, there were people in the Bay Area who made an effort at it. And I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Why is Moon so interested in the media? Well, Moon wants to establish the kingdom of God on earth. He believes that he is the incarnation of God, that he's the Son of God, and that he will be the visible center of the kingdom of God on earth. In the Divine Principle, the book which everyone can have access to, he makes the analogy that the kingdom of heaven is like the physical structure of the body, not unlike an analogy in the New Testament. And that the Messiah, or Christ, will be the brain. The closest disciples will be like the central nervous system. And the media is the thing that would carry the wishes of the brain out to the extremities, the fingers, the arms and the legs. So he likens the communications media to the nervous system. And if you have a global vision and you want to have one world, well, the media is the thing that keeps everybody united, together, on target, communicating with the program. And he knows that the media is very important. Now, that's, of course, in a sense, crazy, but nonetheless, it's all there in the Divine Principle, that analogy that I just made. There's a second reason, and that is legitimization. Now, you may remember back in '73 when all those full-page ads were taken out defending Nixon. That got Moon a lot of attention, and it was kind of a marginal thing, and it was Moon's effort somehow to speak to America and the crisis America was going through, and that didn't go over really well. And Moon had a big problem that he was going to be really separated from mainstream America. And his efforts in the media, I think, were part of his, they are part of his strategy to lend legitimacy to the messianic claim. Now, the people who work for the paper, the people who participate in the science conferences, the media conferences, all the other front groups, including, we should mention, the International Federation for Victory Over Communism, which preceded the International Federation for World Peace by a few years. But in any case, lend legitimacy to the messianic claim. Those people who participate in it don't believe necessarily, well, and I mean, I think it's crazy too, but nonetheless they lend legitimacy simply by being there, by being photographed with the principles, by kind of being a fellow traveler, to use an old phrase. If you have Nobel Prize winners attending science conferences, if you have award-winning journalists in photographs, if Al Newharth attends a world media conference, pictures are taken, movies are made. Those movies are shown to people over in Korea and Japan. The Korean guys scratch their heads and go, gee, Moon's there with this Nobel laureate in physics, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, a Nobel laureate in neurophysiology, for those of you into mind-body problems. It lends a certain, people think, well, maybe I have to reassess my view of Moon. Maybe he's not quite as crazy. I mean, maybe he's a little crazy, but so it kind of weakens an opinion. It neutralizes possible enemies. It adds plausibility. It also provides contacts, which can lead to recruitment. Now, of course, it's Moon's vision that these people eventually will see the truth and become members, but that's a kind of a long-range project. But nonetheless, they are talking to people whom they surely would not meet on the sidewalks. So it is a mechanism for a sophisticated recruitment device, and from time to time, people do join who have professional credentials that otherwise wouldn't come into contact with the organization. Another function of these efforts are to sustain the faith of the members. Now, there aren't that many members. The best way to figure that out, I believe, is to count the participants in the mass weddings. Over 20 years, you get a good idea of membership. It's a good, hard, public number. There aren't that many. So Moon has to worry about continually maintaining the faith of those people. Well, those people see the pictures, the movies, they have personal conversations with these very important, prestigious people, and it kind of reinforces their internal decision of commitment to Moon. And they know that these people may not necessarily buy the theology yet, but they're kind of participating, they're on the track. Maybe there is a possibility that we can achieve the kingdom of God on earth, which incidentally was supposed to have occurred in 1981. When I joined in '69, that was the year. It's been pushed back. Also, these people are sources of information. You get professional journalists, you get professors, you get other generals, you get, retired people who head up internal security committees in the U.S. Congress. You get these people involved. They're sources of information. They give intelligence. They unwittingly or wittingly, they're pumped for information. They give out information. Moon, and all that information goes back. There's no question about it. It all goes right back. So Moon gets a lot of information from all these people. And the people who pass it on to him sift through it, and they can tell what's important and what's not important. And they pass on what's important about anything, whether it's about the security commitments in Northeast Asia or other parts in the world. So there are also these professionals who are recruited in do provide information. Also, it's a training mechanism for members, which goes back to point number one, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. Mike Marshall, the editor of The World and I, or Bob Morton, who's the editor of the New York Tribune, which was formerly the News World, these people are being trained. So they were young kids who joined a movement who've been in journalism now for 10 or 15 years. They're being groomed, whether it's Josette Sheeran at the Washington Times or Ted Agris at the Washington Times or even Richard Murphy or Sarah Cooper Ryder or a variety of these people who are there. They're being trained to head up these institutions in the future. And as the vision is as things open up in God's providence, well, then these people will be qualified to step into a position of leadership in authority in kind of a more secular context. So they are training mechanisms as well for the members. How much longer do I have? Okay. There should be a special word about influence in Korea. I think it is impossible to communicate the impact of what goes on in Washington to Korea. A lot of people will say, well, how does Moon actually influence the newspaper? Well, I explain it this way. Suppose a Saudi, and I explained it this way about 5 years ago. It's particularly interesting now. Suppose a Saudi Arabian prince started a daily newspaper in Washington. It was totally bankrolled by Saudi money. Okay? 95% we're talking about here. Very little advertising, not much in circulation. And suppose out of the staff of 250 or whatnot, about 40 of them were Saudi citizens. Okay. Who would sign up for the paper? Many Zionists? How many Zionists would become editor or reporter and whatnot? I don't think any. There's an automatic self-selection process that goes on there. That's influence right there. Yesterday, I heard this, so the Saudi example is particularly relevant nowadays, but yesterday on Crossfire, 2 newspapers were held up. One was the Washington Post, one was Washington Times. The Washington Post said Bush says there's no war signs coming from Bush. And the Washington Times headline yesterday apparently said Bush preparing the nation for war. That occurred yesterday in our nation's capital. So anyway, to get back to the point, if you have a mechanism like that, there are ways of influence that even the choice of the name, Washington Times, it's kind of it's in competition with the Washington Post and the New York Times just by picking the title. Well, the title was pre-chosen. The design of the graphics, the positioning of the headlines, where you put something on a back page or a front page. And when you use the UPI or the AP wire service, and it's by some reporter for UPI or AP, but then in the middle of the story you put brackets with other information. So I found that you could see discernible and direct influence in regard to matters related to Moon, and particularly in regard to matters related to Northeast Asian security. And I think those are pretty clear mechanisms for influence. Well, anyway, these things get back to Korea, and the impact in that nation are enormous. When I was involved with the paper in New York, News World, 50 copies every day, or they'd be batched once a week, would be sent to Korea and distributed all around there to build up Moon's credibility. And you cannot imagine the importance of national security issues to South Korea, particularly when I was involved in the late 1970s. To have a Korean citizen running a daily newspaper in the capital of the United States, which had basically been the security umbrella for that country since the Korean War, it is enormously influential in Korea. And I think surely deserving of a closer look. And with that, I'll welcome your questions later on. Thank you.
All right. If you do have questions, and I encourage you, please, to have questions, please write them down, pass them to the side aisles, and the monitors will pick them up. Cynthia, we were scheduled to take a short break now. Do you want to do that, or do you want to press on with this? What do you think? What's the consensus? Shall we keep going? All right, keep going. The Wall Street Journal recently, in an article on the personal intelligence network assembled by President George Bush, said, quote, "The president has sought to court and cultivate his own set of conservative advisors, and James R. Whelan has spoken to the president 4 times since May, mostly about Central America." Mr. Whelan has left a visible mark on American journalism. As managing editor of the Miami News, editor of the Sacramento Union, founding editor, publisher, and chief executive officer of the Washington Times. He's the author of 4 books, most recently, Out of the Ashes, Life, Death, and Transfiguration of Democracy in Chile. He has served as editor-in-chief and executive vice president of Conservative Digest magazine. James Whelan.
Thank you. I hadn't intended to do this, but Bill Cheshire set such an infuriatingly high tone at the beginning that I feel I may need to bring him down a peg or two, and so I'll tell you what I would respond through the many years to the question, well, just what does an editor do? And I would recall the remark of the late Lord Northcliffe of Fleet Street, who said an editor is that person who separates the wheat from the chaff and then prints the chaff. But I would quickly, in our own defense, remark that this was yet and however a higher calling than that, say, of editor of the editorial pages or an editorial writer. A definition of an editorial writer offered by Adlai Stevenson comes to mind. An editorial writer, he said, is that person who, the battle having been fought, rushes onto the battlefield and slays the wounded. Actually, I had intended to begin on quite a different level, and that would have been what I will now do. And it is offering a confession. The confession flows from the events of last evening, which for me were very humbling, and I say that quite sincerely, because until now, my exposure to cults has been on an institutional level. And last evening, for the first time, I became familiar, even moved by the personal dimension of what cults mean in terms of personal anguish and suffering, and yes, of love as well, because it would be impossible to be in that room last evening and not also be aware of the love that was so manifest in the room. So I should say personified, of course, mainly by the honorees. So cults for me will, from this time forward, have a very much more intensely and powerful and penetrating and even searing meaning than simply institutions which in the abstract pose dangers, and there's no question that they do. For that, then, I am also grateful to all of you. I would confess also a sense of humility even before coming to Lincolnshire, fostered by the awareness that almost each and every one of you knows, not only do you know more about cults from your own personal lives than I do, but because of Cynthia Kisser's excellent work in monitoring the media, you also know more about the activities of cults than I do. And you know more about their weaknesses, and alas, and sadly, all too often, there's strengths than I do, and so there's very little I could contribute by way of new information. So I resolved instead to confine my own remarks to two areas in which I might reasonably hope to add to your insights, your awareness of cults. The two are intertwined. The first is what I learned about the Moonies while heading up the Washington Times, and then what I would learn about them subsequently. Like Michael, like Bill Cheshire, and I have to believe, like most of you, it was my own hope that having terminated my relationship with them, that I could put it in my past and never again need to address the question of the Moonies or cults. That has proven impossible. My life for the past 6 years has been, more often than not at the beginning, less so now, a continuing struggle against them. So the first of my points would relate to my own experiences, and the second about the American media. We've heard a good deal about the role of the media in the thinking and the strategies of the cults. Well, I've learned a great deal more about the American media as a result of my own experience with the Moonies than I had heretofore imagined I might yet learn, because I had, until my experience with the Moonies, rather routinely supposed that the media generally, certainly at least generally, would champion good while opposing evil, and I've discovered to my dismay that that is not the case. So, if I might, I will take the second first, the role of the media, and attempt to speak to the relative successes of the cults in not only penetrating and operating the media, but also in muting media criticism, and they have been extraordinarily successful in both of these areas. I began this week in Prague, Czechoslovakia, so it seems to me a good place to begin my remarks this morning in regards to the media, and I would cite for the purpose the relevant words of one of Czechoslovakia's most gifted writers, Milan Kundera, in his most recent book, Immortality. Kundera has this to say about the media in the modern world. The spirit of the mass media, he writes, runs counter to the spirit of culture. Culture is based on the individual. The media lead to uniformity. Culture illuminates the complexity of life. The media simplify. Culture is an unending question. The media know only quick answers. Culture is the guardian of memory. The media chase after the present. If my choice of this quotation seems to say that I have come not to praise but to bury the media, the conclusion is partly true. But I would have to emphasize it is only partly true. What I'm really trying to say, it is not enough to recognize that the media are powerful, pivotal even, in our society. It is also of crucial importance to ask what makes these media Sammies run, not to and recognize the organic weaknesses, so that then, and only then, are you able to better relate to the media. For that purpose, I've invented an acronym to describe the weaknesses. I call that acronym SCAMP, S-C-A-M-P. The first letter, S, stands for the weakness Kundera has spoken of in the quotation I've just read to you, and that is superficiality. And I think it's the most important one of all. A superficiality that manifests itself in many ways. The phenomenon that trivializes the most profound and complex questions, that makes of so many pundits and commentators the terrible simplifiers Kundera and so many others allude to. So the first letter, S, is superficiality. The second letter is cronyism, and its kissing cousin, herdism. Although I must confess that in this context, I am referring mainly to the Moonies among the cults, because they mainly among the cults are themselves active players in the media, operators of media enterprises. Expressed baldly, tigers, in the Spanish expression, tigers, tigres no come tigres, tigers do not eat tigers. Well, media does not maul media. In no small measure, this is because if enough reporters at publication A know enough reporters at publication B, and if A's reporters conclude that B's reporters are really pretty decent working stiffs, then why should they throw stones at them? And this, to an extent that might surprise many of you, is one of the reasons why the Washington Times, why Insight, and why other media publications have escaped so much really serious scrutiny by the rest of the media. Because if A doesn't attack B, then C and D and E are not likely to attack either. In the case of the Washington Times, there's a further wrinkle, a complication into the measure, and that is the Washington Post is so much bigger and so much more powerful that Ben Bradley, the editor, has told me on many occasions that he's reluctant to take a hard look at the Times, because then everyone will accuse him of being the bully on the block. But the problem with that is if the Post, which is closest to the story, doesn't do anything about it, then the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and the other papers aren't likely to either, and that happens. The A in my acronym stands for something nasty, but unfortunately it's also true. It's avarice, or just plain greed. It may shock many of you, but the top reporters at major newspapers, the trendsetters then for the entire trade, are not only earn handsome wages from their employers in the newspapers, but they also, in increasing numbers, earn very handsome sinecures from television appearances and from public speaking. Cynthia, are you listening? The Moonies, perhaps more than any others, and certainly the one I'm most familiar with, they lavish great sums of money on speakers at their various conferences, and they have an endless array of conferences. And increasingly, a great number of those speakers earning handsome speaking fees are from the media themselves. I could take just one example among many, many, and that would be the World Media Conference in Washington in 1989, where one Christopher Matthews of the San Francisco Chronicle was among the speakers. Matthews among the media speakers, and there were a great number of them, as well as senators and congressmen and others. Matthews was paid $2,500 for his exertions. Now, what makes the Matthews case particularly interesting is because I happen to have tangled very bitterly with Matthews in the year 1982, because he was then the principal flack for Speaker Tip O'Neill. And he, Matthews, publicly and very aggressively fought to exclude our reporters from being credentialed to cover the House of Representatives. And did succeed in excluding our reporters for a good time from having access to the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States. He would back down only finally when we threatened a full-fledged First Amendment war and were beginning to recruit some allies for the purpose. Well, the same Christopher Matthews, who felt so terribly guided by principle in 1982, 7 years later, is accepting $2,500 to speak at a media conference. He is not the only one influenced by avarice by a long shot, and unfortunately, he is actually one of a rapidly growing number. The M in scamp stands for something a little bit more complex, and I must here of necessity do even more violence to the concept than I am doing to the others, out of respect for the constraints of time. This M, the one I have in mind, is moral relativism. That disease which is so violently, even pervasive in our society, and virulently so. That non-doctrine doctrine, which holds that there may be good and there may be evil, there just may be evil, but since no one can be sure which is which, then the only real wrong is to condemn anything as evil. That includes pornography, that includes blasphemy, and of course, with a few exceptions, it includes cults. So we reach the last letter, P, which I've labeled prissiness. It is a word I apply to the media's highly selective application of the doctrine of, quote, balance, of, quote, fair play, unquote. So it is that a story on, say, a cult must include the cult's, quote, side, unquote, of the story, as if all stories had sides. Because since there's nothing right and there's nothing wrong, then everything is entitled to equal balance. So there you have it, scamp, superficiality, cronyism, avarice, moral relativism, and prissiness, which, taken together, help to explain why the cults get the largely free ride, which they do get in the media. Now, I am, of course, aware that the media can and does devote stories from time to time to examples of specific wrongdoing, a narrow kind of focused look at cult wrongdoing. But it is very rare to see a piece of reportage that examines the cults in a larger and deeper framework, which includes vivid portrayals of the human suffering that they cause and the damage they do to the larger society. Much less reporting which includes a moral judgment about the very legitimacy, the very propriety in our society of secretive organizations which time and again victimize their own vulnerable and gullible members, and which arguably pose a very real subversive threat to the very nature of what democratic representative government is supposed to be all about. Cults are not the only reason I came to fret about the structural weaknesses of our media any more than cults are central to similar judgments and criticisms made by others. Only Thursday in Washington, I heard that sagacious Eric Severide expressed very similar misgivings about the media which you just heard me express, especially as concerns superficiality and avarice and the herd instinct and the prissiness, in fact, without mentioning cults. I mention cults not just because that's what this conference is all about, but because my own experience with the way the media handles the story about the Washington Times and the other Moonie publications, and since then, has caused me to have very severe reservations about the ability, even, about the aptitude of the media as an instrument for exposing, and an exposure which is desperately needed, the work of these medias. So that would very succinctly, I hope, cover the first of my two themes. So let me pursue very briefly what was the first of my two, and that is why did I sign into this evil empire in the first place. I left a very good job as vice president and editor of the Sacramento Union to become the founding editor, publisher, and chief executive officer of the Washington Times. And I did so out of a conviction. And that's not going to be alien to any of you because the cults, of course, play very effectively on this. In my case, it was the conviction that the capital of the United States deserved to be served by more than a single newspaper voice, and one which has itself, the Washington Post, a very strong ideological bent. And out of the further conviction that I could and would keep the Moonies out. And for 2 years plus, I mainly succeeded in keeping the Moonies out. When the Moonies made it explicit that they were going to muscle into power, I did what I had always said I would do, and that is I left. To my chagrin and to my shock, the very same media which had pilloried and hounded and harassed us so unmercifully when the paper was independent would largely buy into the lies the Moonies invented, not only about my departure, but about the alleged independence of the newspaper. Bill Cheshire and his associates would later reinforce what I was saying in July of '84 when they, each of them, left as I did, stepped out into an employment void, leaving something quite cushy and comfortable, over the question of was it true or was it not true that the paper was independent. When it was not true, I left. It was not true, Bill Cheshire and his associates left, and we all of us left for the unemployment lines for a good time thereafter. But the media didn't handle the story that way, and the more as the days and the weeks and the months would go by, I would ask myself, I wonder why, and then I would look closely at what the media in this country, how it operates, how does it respond to the stimuli, and I would arrive at pretty much the same conclusions that I've just now described to you with Scamp, but there would be one other, and that is a terrible tunnel vision which afflicts so much of what newspaper and television journalism is all about, and that is looking only at pieces of stories in isolation, whereas a cult, and certainly this is true of the Moonies, is a closely integrated, a very carefully, strategically organized whole in which none of the parts operate in isolation from any of the others. At this point, I should say a few words about the Moonies as I view them, and then I'm going to wrap this up as quickly as I can. It is a statement I gave to a reporter early on after leaving the Times to attempt to demonstrate to that reporter why it is a mistake to look at any aspect of the Moonies in isolation, why you need to look at the whole. And it in some ways duplicates some of the things you've heard, but since these are also personal messages, I ask your indulgence. The statement reads as follows: the Moonies are unique. They claim the protection of a religion while employing the tactics of a political movement. Unlike a religion, they seek to win converts, not for eternal life, but as the shock troops of a kingdom here on earth, presided over by their own Messiah. Unlike a political movement, they appeal to mystical and spiritual yearnings rather than the gratification of immediate material needs. Their goal is power. All the rest is subordinate to that goal. The causes they champion, the instruments they create, the personages they recruit, all of these are integral to their purposes. They become immensely powerful. Money does not seem to figure importantly in the calculus of their strategic decisions. Conservative estimates put their annual gross revenues at close to $500 million. The value of their accumulated assets can only be guessed at. Mystery shrouds the arithmetic of their fortunes. But what is clear is that their money increasingly has the same power to buy influence, buy reputations, as does respectable money. They are evil. They speak of God while worshiping a false God. They use anti-communism as an antidote to healthy skepticism. They attach themselves to self-serving causes, such as, for example, religious freedom a year or two ago, only when it became relevant to their own purposes, their own Messiah then being in the slammer. They are subverting our political system. They're doing it through front organizations, most of them disguised, and through their funding of independent organizations, through the placement of volunteers in the inner sanctums of hard-pressed organizations. In every instance, those who attend their conferences, those who accept their money, or their volunteers, delude themselves that there is no loss of virtue because the Moonies have not proselytized. That misses the central, crucial point. The Moonies are a political movement in religious clothing. Moon seeks power, not the salvation of souls. To achieve that, he needs religious fanatics as his palace guard and shock troops. But more importantly, he needs secular conscripts, seduced by money, free trips, free services, seemingly endless bounty and booty, in order to give him respectability, and with it, that image of influence which translates as power. I would close by asking all of you to place again on your agendas, and perhaps assign a high priority to it, to forcing your elected representatives in state legislatures, in the Congress, to the extent that the media listens at all, to insist on asking at least 3 questions about this organization. 1, where did they get all this money in the first place? 2, what exactly are they spending it on? Exactly, where's it going? And 3, why? Because if we don't force, and if we don't find a mechanism for unmasking them, then I have no doubt that they will do very, very serious damage, not only to the lives of many innocent, but also to the institutions of our country. Thank you.
Got lots of good questions, and then some real strange questions too. Okay. First question to Mr. Cheshire. When you were hired as editorial page editor of the Washington Times, on the premise, I suppose, that the Moonies would not interfere, what led you to believe that they would indeed not interfere? How could you have been so surprised?
I was going to say dumb. But when Jim Whelan shanghaied me from a safe and secure and pleasant spot as editor-in-chief of the Charleston Daily Mail, he assured me in the best of faith that the Unification Church, and specifically the Reverend Moon and his henchman, Colonel Bohe Pak, had guaranteed him and guaranteed Smith Hempstone, his executive editor, that the non-Mooney employees of the newspaper would have no worry or concern about interference by the church in the management and operation of the newspaper, and that indeed we would operate it as if we owned it. These guarantees were more than just words spoken into the air. They were given concrete form by contractual agreements that Mr. Whelan and Mr. Hempstone had with the owners. Unfortunately for Mr. Whelan and Mr. Hempstone and me, 6 months after I joined the Washington Times, Mr. Whelan was no longer there, taking his contract with him, and within a year of my employment at the Washington Times, Mr. Hempstone had been met at the airport in Madrid, Spain, by the Mooney lawyer, Phil Green, and advised that he was no longer employed. And so none of us was left with any contractual protection, and we were at the mercy of our employers who, it turned out, strangely enough, had been acting in bad faith.
Okay, next question for Mr. Whelan. What is wrong with the Unification Church owning a newspaper? It's a business, just like any other, isn't it?
No, it is not a business like any other. It is, in the best reading of their status, it is a religious movement which is therefore, by the First Amendment, twice shielded from close public scrutiny, as of course, as a media entity itself, but also as a religious organization. But I don't give it its best reading in any event. What's wrong with it is that it is a secretive cult which derived its original fortunes from sources utterly unknown, which has a clear and unmistakable political agenda, and that is an absolute violation of the most fundamental canons of American journalism. The two need to be completely separate. The media is the conscience. It is not constitutionally conceived of as an actor in the drama. So the second thing is that. And the third thing that's wrong with it is that, as Bill has already suggested, the ownership of that newspaper is probably operating it in direct violation of at least one very major piece of legislation, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and maybe some others. And I know of no other newspaper ownership in the United States about which that could be said.
Thank you. Question for Mr. Warder. As a propagandist for Moon, do you object to that? Okay. As a propagandist for Moon, did you feel you were legitimately spreading the faith through channels of information, or did you feel you were intentionally misleading people, manipulating people, deliberately distorting the news in order to further Moon's goals?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Thank you. That's my question.
At the time I was in the organization, I was a 100%er like everybody in the inner core. And the standard for good and evil was whether or not it helped the purpose of the movement. Anything that helped the purpose of the movement was good. Anything that acted against the movement was bad. And that literally was the definition under which members operated. So the second part of your question is a prudential judgment question. And that is, in the presentation of anything, whether it was the Divine Principle lectures or whether it was in the daily turning out of a newspaper in New York City, was it helpful for the purpose or not? Now, if you presented information that was true but harmful, then that clearly wasn't any good. On the other hand, if you avoided presenting information that many people knew was true, and they would see that you were attempting to, distort things in some way, then prudential judgment would say, well, you can't do that either, because that also would harm the credibility of the enterprise. So you had to make prudential judgments like that continually. Is that?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Question for Mr. Whelan. Early in your tenure with the Washington Times, the questioner heard you on Larry King's radio show late at night. At that time, you gave the Times and its ownership very high praise. Since you have left the Washington Times, has Larry King or any other widely heard talk show host given you an opportunity to be heard?
Yes, not Larry King, but a great number of others. And in fact, as recently as Thursday, let's say 2 days ago, this week, I taped an interview with Jack Anderson for his television program on the Moonies. It's been a fairly continuing process. But I would also then have to quickly add that certainly through the early years, almost everything that I would attempt to say about the Moonies would be then represented in caricature in virtually every single story or broadcast that I would become aware of. There was an atmosphere of circus that pervaded so much of the coverage. I seem to sense that in recent times there seemed to have been a series of stories in recent months which again are looking a little bit more responsibly at what they're doing. I'm not all sure that I know the reason why. I do know this, that I have no doubt the Moonies are far more powerful today, far more powerful than they have ever been. That was even in the halcyon years of Richard Nixon before Jonestown.
Next question. Actually, two questions very related, I guess, for Mr. Cheshire and Mr. Warder. What do you think we as citizens can do to influence our leaders to demand that Moon be registered for his foreign interests in the Washington Times and other publications? And the follow-up is to Mr. Warder. Do you think a letter-writing campaign by Can to Congress regarding Moon and the Foreign Agent Registration Act would have some effect? I guess Mr. Cheshire wants you to take the first shot at that.
It is going to be terribly difficult for reasons that Mr. Whelan has addressed. The Moon money has made such serious inroads into our nation's capital that there is a lack of enthusiasm for tracking down the money and its source and enforcing such things as the Foreign Agents Registration Act. But it's worth the effort. And all I can suggest that you do is to get in touch with your representatives in Congress and urge them to urge the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Justice Department to enforce the law on the books. I wrote some months ago, Senator Claiborne Pell, who is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and suggested that it might be an interesting endeavor on the part of his committee to discharge its responsibilities for supervising the enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And I got a letter back from him advising me that no, this was not his responsibility, it was the responsibility of some other committee. I'm sure that he's wrong, it's the responsibility of this committee. I'm sure if I wrote the chairman of the other committee, he would tell me that it was Senator Pell's responsibility, and he would continue to get this runaround in Washington. But if enough people insist loudly enough and with sufficient perseverance on having the law enforced, it is conceivable that someday the establishment in Washington may, however reluctantly, get around to doing the job that we pay them handsome salaries to do.
I'd add to that that one of the problems is that you have a lot of people being paid significant sums of money by Moon in Washington. These include, of course, the people at the Washington Times, but it also includes a wide variety of public policy experts, Washington, political junkies, a whole host of lobbying and other organizations. And those guys, they're professionals at all this stuff, and they're paid a lot of money. And you may recall when the issue came whether or not the Supreme Court was going to review the tax question of Moon's guilt or innocence related to the tax. There was a massive campaign launched on behalf of religious freedom, and there were clergymen coming out of the woods and all kinds of people who I thought would know better coming to Moon's defense under the great principle of freedom of religion, which of course is a great principle actually. But so that's a real limiting factor. The letter writing campaign, I've never. I think if you feel motivated to do letters, by all means do letters. But I have a feeling that the people in those congressional offices who will receive the letters will sense that it's an orchestrated campaign, which is not totally bad to know that there is an orchestrated campaign of some consequence. But then if you were going to orchestrate that campaign, you better have a massive, massive quantity of mail just so that they get the message that there is a lot of support. I think that's probably difficult. What might be better would be to hire, and this is a terrible thing to say, I'm rather cynical about things in Washington lately, but hire somebody in Washington full-time to track down and nail those guys on those various committees persistently, leaking stories to the Washington Post about, you know how that would go. Well, anyway, what you have to do, you have to, orchestrate a campaign there. But I think it might be a little less emotionally exciting, but it might get the result.
Thank you. Mr. Whelan, how strong was the Unification Church's relationship to the Reagan administration? And does that relationship still exist in the Bush presidency?
Very well connected to the Reagan administration. That claim that the Washington Times is the first paper the president reads, we also were able to extract from Ronald Reagan the first 3 months. As it happens, there were a great number of Moonies who had managed to insinuate or insert themselves into, for example, the Reagan campaign as volunteers. It's one of their specialties. They provide unpaid volunteers. I remember another time, Carl Alberts, principal, I don't want to suggest anything illicit here, because it wasn't, as near as I can tell, but his principal source of female solace, and again, not illicit, and I stress that, was a Moonie who was able to devote a great deal of time to ministering to his off-hours needs. They're very good at that, and they were very effective in the Reagan administration in placing a number of their people and or their friends in key places. My understanding is they've been far less successful with the Bush administration, but it would be a dramatic error to believe that they are not either able to work their will in important ways. I've attended a number of Roosevelt Room meetings at the White House where the president would brief a group of 8, 10, 12 people, and almost always among them was Bob Grant, head of the American Freedom Coalition. Now, people I know at the White House are perfectly well aware that Bob Grant and the American Freedom Coalition is a Mooney Front organization. And they don't like that, but they can't afford to ignore it either. Very recently was an episode in which Bohe Pak celebrated his birthday, and one of his lackeys at the birthday party presented him with a letter signed by George Bush. Now, the story that I read on that incident made light of it. Well, these letters are about as valuable as the wallpaper in this room. They don't then understand the Mooney psyche, because the Moonies understand perfectly well that those letters, translated into 96 languages and reproduced 10 million copies around the world, what do they say to the unwary everywhere? Hey, look how powerful we are. So the Reagan administration extremely well connected, Bush administration less so, but it would be a dramatic error to believe that they are not influential and able to project their points of view, their interests, and to sit in the councils of power, because they do all of those things.
Can I just add something? I don't think that there is like a silver bullet, a thing to do to wipe out the problem related to Moon or some of the other cults. I think that your organization will surely grow, because I think more, as our society, it seems to me my impression would be, and it's not, it's just, I guess from my vantage point doing what I'm doing now, is we're in a severe cultural crisis. The mainline religions are failing to reach people. Our families are breaking down in this country. Our educational system has problems. Our arts and literature seems to be, not quite up to standard lately. And I think that these large social and cultural forces set the environment for some guy to come in with a message And that's, I think, ultimately the thing that inoculates a society against a siren song. It's, you know, having a decent functioning society and all the things that go into that. And that's how.
Question for Mr. Cheshire and Mr. Whelan. Two different questions, but the same thing. Could you briefly describe what specific actions the Moon organization took that caused you to resign from the Washington Times and the church, respectively?
Well, I've explained the contractual relationship that Mr. Whelan had and Mr. Johnstone, and the assurances that were extended by them to professional journalists who joined the Washington Times. As Mr. Whelan has indicated, while he was at the Times, he did a pretty good job of policing the Mooney interference. In fact, he was a bear on the subject, and did not hesitate to wage open warfare with Colonel Bohee Pot when he would insinuate himself, or try to insinuate himself into the operations of the newspaper. Once Mr. Whelan left, the wall of separation between the newspaper operation and the Unification Church began slowly to crumble. When Mr. Borgrove came aboard as editor-in-chief, it vanished. My first indication that Borgrove had wholly capitulated to the owners in terms of destroying the autonomy of the operating staff of the newspaper came soon after his arrival as editor-in-chief, when he preempted the letters to the editor space on my editorial page to run what he referred to as a letter to our readers from the editor-in-chief, in which he appealed to President Reagan to grant a presidential pardon to the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who had at that time just completed his 13-year stretch. The 13 months, I'm sorry.
There's a lot of wishful thinking in this room right now.
Well, 13 short months. Not long after that, the newspaper began to run a series of, all newspapers began to run a series of stories about the religious organizations that were coming to the defense of Moon and appealing for justice for Moon under the guise of protecting the rights of the religious rights under the First Amendment. And the newspaper began to do something that is regarded in the business as reprehensible. That is to say, they would take wire service copy describing Moon's release from prison, describing the protests that were being mounted on his behalf, and they would inject down into the story matter that was defending Moon against the tax rap. And they did not do, as Mr. Marta mentioned earlier, close this material in brackets to indicate that it had been inserted. They left the brackets off. They retained the wire service logo so that the reader of the Washington Times was under the impression that these were defenses that were being made. I objected to this somewhat strenuously with Mr. Borgrove on several occasions. For my pains, the tongue lashing from the editor-in-chief gave me to understand that I was had taken leave of my senses. This was common everyday practice in the business, and he certainly had not been ordered to write his appeal for presidential pardon. It was something that he did because his sense of fairness and justice cried out for him to make a stand for Reverend Moon. It had nothing to do with the fact that he was receiving great big bucks from Reverend Moon and capitulated to his wishes. I finally wrote a long memorandum to Borgrove, in which I spelled out all the things that they had been doing that I regarded as A, foolish, and B, contrary to the autonomy agreement under which I had been employed. And I sent a copy of this to the person for whose eyes I had actually created it, Colonel Bowie Park, and this did not endear me to the Bourgeois, and I don't think it really endeared me to Colonel Park. But at any rate, I managed to keep my job and hold them at bay to some extent for another year or so. But on April the 17th, 1987, I had a staff meeting, as I did in the morning, which the Bourgeois always attended, and I told my staff that there was a development in South Korea that we needed to take some notice of on the editorial page, to wit, President Tong II had broken off his talks with the political opposition, these talks having in mind the democratization of South Korea and the holding of free elections in that country, and that I thought we had to criticize the President of Korea for having done this, and we had to make several points, one of them being that it eroded the position of South Korea in the American Congress and among the American public, and that neither Congress nor the American people could be expected to continue to support at great expense some 40,000 American foot soldiers in Korea if they were there to defend an autocratic and repressive regime that broke its word to the political opposition and was thwarting the democratization process. Bourgeois, strangely, I thought, said, well, that sounds fine to me. Go ahead. So I assigned my deputy to write the editorial, and I set about writing a piece on economics, as I remember. The Bourgeois vanished upstairs, it turned out, to the office of Ambassador Han, Bowie Park's principal lieutenant, and de facto publisher or CEO or whatever he is of the Washington Times. And a few minutes later, my secretary called into my office and said, the Bourgeois wants to know who's writing the Korean editorial. I said, tell him Bonifield's writing it. And on back to work. 15 minutes later, one of my writers, David Shiflett, came to my office and he said, did you hear what the Bourgeois told Bonifield? I said, no, I didn't. Why? He told him to reverse course on the Korean editorial and defend President Tong II and say the political opposition is composed of a bunch of idiots. No sensible government would have anything to do with them, and perfectly right to break off talks with the opposition, and so forth and so on. So I went to see Bonifield and confirmed it. Make a long story short, at 2 o'clock when the Bourgeois came back to his lair, Bonifield and I went up, and I told the Bourgeois, who was, to give you a little, flesh this out a little for you, a local color. The Bourgeois slept in his office at that time. He had a murky bed that pulled down from the wall, and he literally lived in his office, slept there. So he was sitting on his bed munching an Oreo cookie. And I said, Arno, we have a problem. He said, what is it? I said, you have reversed course on the Korean editorial after going upstairs and conferring with Ambassador Han. And this is a serious breach of the autonomy agreement, one that can't be ignored. And he said, in somewhat more volubly than I'm speaking now, these guys, meaning Park and Han, know more about what goes on in Korea than any of the three of us, and we would be stupid not to avail ourselves of their expert knowledge on Korean affairs before weighing in with an editorial on political developments in South Korea. I said, Arno, Ambassador Han is a former career diplomat of the South Korean government, former ambassador to Norway. Colonel Park is a former colonel in the military of South Korea, former deputy military attaché at the South Korean Embassy in Washington, probably an officer in the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. And to pretend that these people are in any wise objective authorities on affairs in South Korea is absolutely foolish and naive, and I can't believe that you expect me to believe that. He flew into a tirade and denounced me with some passion, and told me, I don't give a damn what you write. You can put anything you want to on the editorial page. I won't even read it. I said, Arno, you have missed the point. The point is that you may, in my judgment, no longer be relied on to stand up to the Moonies when they want to work their will on the newspaper. And this is the understanding I had when I came to work here, and you have transgressed that understanding in the most serious way, and it cannot be ignored. He stormed out of the office, threw his plate full of Oreo cookies in the sink. I went back down to my office, briefed my staff, told them that my intention was to resign my job that day, but that I thought this was a decision that each of us had to reach on his own, depending on the dictates of his own conscience. We all had families and mortgages and responsibilities to worry about, and I was going to leave, walk outside. I would come back in a little while and they could tell me what they had decided to do. I came back and 4 of the 5 had decided to resign with me. We thought it would be unprofessional to leave the paper in the lurch without putting out the next day's editorial page, so we turned to do that. We did not have the Korean editorial that Dvorak had ordered up. That was produced the day after we left and appeared in the following day's newspaper. We put the paper out, we put the page to bed, and walked up to Dvorak's office and resigned. And as we walked out the door, I was walking with my friend and colleague David Shiflett. A beautiful sunny day in Washington, one of those glorious days that Washington has too few of. Sun shining brightly. Shiflett looked up at the sky and he said, "Hello, sunshine. Goodbye, moon."
Mr. Ward.
I can't resist a little biographical note about Dvorak, who, by the way, was on my clandestine payroll long before he would surface in his other role. Dvorak was a little fellow, a short fellow, and he's Belgian-born. Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, had been a close friend of Dvorak's during the years that they both worked at Newsweek magazine, and indeed had been best man at one of Dvorak's weddings. As the years would go by, they drifted apart. When Ben Bradley learned that Dvorak was going around town saying that he was 16th in line for the throne of Belgium, Bradley dubbed him the Short Count. The episode which Bill describes is rare, because the Moonies understand all too well that the exercise of power in a newspaper comes not from tampering. You don't need to do that with picture caption at page 3 or the placing stories at page 1, or even editorials. Rare do they feel that is the source of power in a newspaper. If you think about it in your own lives, in almost any community in the United States of America, the newspaper publisher is one of the 2 or 3 most influential guys in town. Not because of the magnitude of the business, because typically newspapers are not very big businesses. In all the Fortune 500, you have to go down to 200 and something to find the first newspaper company. So that's not the reason. It's because it's a big business. And yet, one of the articles of faith of American newspaper publishing is that publishers don't intrude on the editorial product. Well, it's the editorial product that makes the paper powerful. And if they don't have any role, any voice in the editorial product, which makes the paper powerful, how come they're powerful? Well, the Moonies understand the answer to that. It's the perception of power. Hey, who really runs this place anyway? Expressed differently, I heard Gene Pell, the brilliant director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, this week speak of one of the problems of the emerging media in Eastern Europe, and that is that those guys still hear little voices in the back of their head. That's where it's really happening. It's the whole atmosphere, and anybody who doesn't understand that is asking the wrong questions. If you ask, well, are you editorial autonomous at the Washington Times? And our little paragraph says, oh yeah, sure, we got editorial autonomy. The very, you know, even if he were a reliable witness, one need only look at the record of the Honor of the Board to understand that, well, I'd like to express it graciously. And so I'll come back to you the next day or two when I can think of something gracious to say. It simply would defy all logic and reason. So, therefore, what happened in my circumstance needs to be understood in this other context. It's a metaphysical context, but it is very real. And it is a context in which the real power of a newspaper actually is understood to reside and is projected. The agreement that we had, and by the way, Bill, I learned a great deal because of this experience. One of the things I learned in my naivete is a contract is a piece of paper. This has never occurred to me. People say, hey, well, don't you have a contract? A contract is only valid so long as the two parts are willing to recognize it. If one or the other parties chooses not to, there's an option. It's called litigation. Well, how would you like to litigate against the Moonies? They have law firms representing the law firms. So they understood, and I understood, that the only way the newspaper could be truly independent is if we truly controlled it, if we truly could enforce a number of canons. And we did. One of them is there would be absolutely no commingling of the newspaper with any religious purpose. I didn't give a blast whose religious purposes. The premise of the newspaper were strictly off limits to all religious purposes. They were off limits to all Moonie front organizations of any kind, whatever. You cannot use these premises. And they tried again and again. There will be no fraternization on our company time between any member of the staff and any member of the Moonie religious organization. At no public event at which this newspaper is represented will any member of their organization also be present, nor vice versa. These things are important. They're not just symbols. They say to the world, who really runs this place anyway? And the answer is, we run it. And I had to fight these guys tooth and nail from the very beginning, but managed mainly to keep them out. There came a point in time. They'd have to answer the question, why this time? Guess they felt they were now strong enough, at which first through the lawyer Phil Green, Bill has already alluded to, and then Pock himself, that they intended to seize direct control of the business operations of the newspaper, but you guys would still have editorial autonomy. Of course, I knew that was hogwash, and so started fighting behind the scenes. Finally, the fight, I had to take and involve all the senior members of my staff, the senior managers, the senior editors, and we had a series of meetings and apprised them. And then finally, Pock assembled the same group, and he said, look, Pock's English is quite good, by the way. And it's not as good as his doctorate would seem to have you believe, because the doctorate he got from the University of La Plata, Argentina, for $1 million, another story. But his English is not completely colloquial, and so the term he used was, we want Jim to stay as our hero, our champion. He will still be our front man. Well, now, just a minute, hang on just a minute. You know, all the same perks and responsibilities, he'll still be our great hero and champion. We pray, Jim, we these are three things, to stay, but we've got to exercise direct control. I understood perfectly well, as I understand perfectly well, once that happens, then the newspaper is no longer independent. And indeed, that independence would, as Bill has already indicated, begin to crumble and finally vanish altogether. So it was over that issue and no other. Then, of course, the Moonies are clever fellows, and so they've invented a contract dispute, which is non-existent. I wish there had been a contract dispute. But the real answer was that I said to the world again and again, I said to the staff and I recruited them, people able, people of integrity, people of high professional quality, that you can guarantee that this paper is independent because I tell you it's independent. And you can believe it. And then I surround myself with other people that can also believe it. And you will be able to believe it because we're here. And the moment it's no longer true, you'll know it because we won't be here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Warder, same question. What specific actions made you get out?
Well, I don't, my case is a little bit different than these two gentlemen. I think there were two developments which triggered the decision to leave. First, in the late 1970s, several Koreans were brought in who had been long-term members. A guy named Kwok, a guy named Lee, another guy named Tiger Pak, these great names. And these people were put in kind of supervisory roles, whereas before I would report directly to Moon, there was a kind of a buffer being set up. Not exclusively, but a buffer was being put in place. And these guys would do whatever Moon said exactly, to the T. And they expected everybody else to. Well, I, tried to use discretion. Like, for instance, we were supposed to compete with the New York Times, right? This is ridiculous, but... but on the other hand, we were supposed to attack Congressman Fraser. So we have all these stories repeatedly about Congressman Fraser. And it kind of eroded the credibility of the paper, this idea that the paper was competing with the New York Times. And other things like that that applied to other things I was responsible for. So the Korean guys were always enthusiastic to take the hard line on these things, and I would always try and say, well, there's this and that, and try and work things out. But that became increasingly oppressive, and these guys were ultimately gaining more and more say on operations. And this raised a lot of questions in my mind, and I spoke with people about them, that although we share the same purpose, there's questions of methodology involved here, and the methods that were being employed were counterproductive to the purposes. And, and they say, well, it's an international movement, and you have different people from Korea and Japan and Germany and, America, and these cultural clashes are inevitable. But the cultural clashes were always one way. There were no comparable Americans or Westerners over in Korea creating similar or analogous cultural problems, because they were never in a position to do that. And over a period of time, I began to reach the conclusion that Moon had a literal, biologic belief in the superiority of Koreans, and that they, among the Orientals, were superior, but Orientals were superior to all the rest anyway. So there's a real racial, nationalistic hierarchy involved in the concept. And in the divine principle, there is this idea of Korea as a chosen nation. You can interpret that in various ways. I'd put that more in a cultural or even a heuristic or metaphoric way. But it became apparent that this was a very literal thing. That was disturbing. Secondly, my wife, we were married in 1975. She came to the United States. She's an American citizen, but she joined the church in Paris. She, after 2 years, came to live with me in New York. We had a little girl. And shortly after her birth, Moon established a nursery in Tarrytown. And all of the couples were called together by Moon at a meeting in the New Yorker, and basically ordered to put the children in a nursery in Tarrytown. We were living on 34th and 8th Avenue in Manhattan. So this was very difficult. But we did it. And then about 2 weeks later, and we would see our daughter on the weekend, on Sunday. And about 2 weeks later, we had a meeting over at Belvedere Estates. And this was kind of phase 2, and he must have known phase 2 before he started phase 1. He basically ordered all of the wives to go on a 3-year evangelical mission for CART on the West Coast. So, my wife at the time was 3 months pregnant, and she went off to California on this trip, led by Tiger Pop. In the meantime, in the nursery, our daughter, she would literally, there would be one person assigned to take care of 5 infants, and when the person wasn't there, they would have these tape recordings of Korean language so that the kids would learn to speak Korean. The lady who ran the nursery couldn't speak English. But the idea was that Korean was the heavenly language, so they were going to get a leg up on the rest of us, and that sort of thing. It's pretty grisly, grim stuff. So anyway, my wife was out in California. In the 8th month of pregnancy, she returned to New York. That summer was very difficult for us. We talked a lot. She didn't think she could go on with it. I was having problems with the paper. Kind of a different set of problems, but somewhat related to what was spoken of earlier. And eventually, my wife and I, we jointly decided that we would leave. And I felt obligated to follow through with one final science conference in Los Angeles in November, and there was a media conference, the second media conference in New York at the Plaza in October, and I saw those 2 things through, and then we left.
Thank you. We are running out of time, running short on time, so let's address some of the questions that seek solutions. And this I think we should address to everyone. Please give us some specific advice on how to present the cult and mind control problem to newspaper and magazine editors. We have quite a few questions related to this. What can we do to get more attention, to fight back, to minimize cult influence? What specific things can we do to get more attention from the media?
Well, obviously the media are interested in human drama. They're interested in individual cases where a child may be kidnapped and brainwashed and removed from a family setting. So these are very agonizing and traumatic experiences. So if you have such a situation, and you know of such a situation, bring that to the attention of your local newspaper, television, radio station, whatever. That might give you some publicity. As far as the Moonies are concerned and their insidious influence in this country and insidious influence over its government, over its other institutions, including the press, both Jim Whelan and I have mentioned before the problem, the difficulty of interesting elected representatives in doing something about it. But there is one thing you might do. If indeed you know your United States Senator or your U.S. representative personally, have a good relationship with him, perhaps are a contributor to his campaign, he very likely will listen to you and take what you say seriously if you approach him in a serious, non-emotional, rational form and explain to him the seriousness of the problem and ask him what can be done about it. If there were a member of Congress who was sufficiently influential in the administration to go to Bill Sessions, the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and present to him the need for an investigation by the Justice Department, by the FBI, of areas in which the Unification Church is in violation of, among other things, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, something might get done. I don't think anything's going to be done about legislatively or governmentally about the Church of Scientology or many of the other cults that are of concern to various members of this audience, unless they're transgressing some statute or other. They're protected by the First Amendment. And what you have to wage is a public opinion campaign to enlighten people as to their ruthlessness, their lack of integrity, their horrible nature. So that's a much more difficult job in many ways than persuading the agencies of the federal government to go about their discharge of their duties. And so you have to, it seems to me, you have to confronting two problems. The Unification Church is sort of a unique problem in that it has involved itself so extensively and probably illegally in so many aspects of our culture that they have become vulnerable to attack on a number of fronts, including legal fronts. Other cults will have to be attacked in a different way. And it's
Mr. Mortar, from your perspective, from the other side, having been on the other side of this propaganda war or information war, what can we do? We don't have those kind of resources.
Well, I was going to say, build on what you've currently done. I think you're doing an excellent job. I think that, you know, there are reporters here for various publications as testimony to it. Those reporters in time will want fame and fortune for their writing. So hopefully they'll write good stories, and hopefully readers will read them and talk about them and discuss them. You might buy some extra copies of their publication, which always gets the attention of people, and distribute them. And keep clips and distribute those clips to other journalists so that they too can become rich and famous like the guy who wrote this story. And I would urge you to keep the clips, arrange them by topics, and periodically just dump them on someone's desk who you know is interested. Do the work for them. Make it easy. And I know that you're doing that now. I think it is extremely important to do. And I would just say build on what you're currently doing, because I think, you know, you are doing good work.
Mr. Whelan.
Attack. Attack, attack, attack. The people who are accepting their favors, the pastors, the congressmen, the civic leaders. Attack. Make them accountable. Make them respond, because as long as they think they can get away with it, they go on, and then the pyramid gets larger, the pyramid of influence and power. Make people respond, answer for why did you attend this conference? Why did you accept their privileges, their travel and so forth? After that, as I've already indicated, I'm pretty pessimistic, except about ad hoc stories, the kind Bill has mentioned about individual cases. I'm pretty pessimistic about the media. I think the best chance lies in finding some means, not to promote a congressional investigation, because I don't think that's going to happen, but to get one or two guys in Congress at least brave enough to put some heat on the Justice Department to go after the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Thank you. We are out of time. One other question that came in. What happens when Moon dies? Assuming he doesn't rise from the dead in 3 days, I suggest we have a big party. That's right. That's an unlikely event. Thank you very much, gentlemen.